BRICS continues to grow in influence and is becoming one of the most important organizations on Earth. BRICS is a Global South-led forum that was founded in 2009 by Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and then in 2010, South Africa joined. Since then, BRICS has continued to grow. In 2024, 4 new countries were officially admitted as full members, which include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. And then at a historic summit in the Russian city of Kazan in October 2024, 13 more countries were officially invited to become partner countries of BRICS. In December, Russia confirmed that 9 of those 13 countries have accepted the invitation, and on the 1st of January 2025, the following 9 countries will now become partner countries of BRICS: Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Thailand, Uganda, and Uzbekistan. And then the other 4 countries that were invited but have not yet accepted the invitation include Algeria, Nigeria, Turkey, and Vietnam. And Russia made it clear that those 4 countries could potentially join as well. They did not reject the invitation, but as of the end of 2024, they had not given an official response. So I made a map that shows the composition of BRICS as of the 1st of January 2025. And now there are 9 full members of BRICS. There are 9 partner countries. There are 4 countries that have been invited to be partners but have not yet officially given an answer. There is 1 country that was invited to be a full member that has not given an answer, that's Saudi Arabia. And there was 1 country that was invited to be a full member but rejected the offer, which is Argentina. When it was originally invited to join, Argentina's center-left government of President Alberto Fernandez said that he was going to join. But then before officially Argentina was accepted, the very right-wing pro-US leader Javier Milei came to power, and he rejected the offer before Argentina officially joined in January of 2024. So what's noteworthy, as you can see on the map, is that BRICS is very powerful in Asia, and it's growing as well in Africa. There are 4 countries that are now part of BRICS officially, and there are 2 more that may be part of BRICS in the near future, Algeria and Nigeria. And Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa. Algeria has the largest landmass in Africa. Over in Latin America, there are now 3 countries in BRICS, including the largest and most populous country in the region, Brazil, with the biggest economy, also including Bolivia and Cuba. Of course, Cuba is a country that has been suffocated for over 60 years by an illegal U.S. blockade. The U.S. has tried to destroy the Cuban economy ever since the revolution in 1959. But Cuba has always been very important in global South movements fighting against colonialism and imperialism. Cuba was part of the non-aligned movement during the First Cold War, and today Cuba has still played a very important role in encouraging unity across the global South. This means that BRICS now has 18 members and partners, and together they represent more than 41% of the global economy when GDP is measured at purchasing power parity, and they represent roughly half of the entire world population. As I'll show later in this analysis today, BRICS also represents more than 1/3 of global oil production, and BRICS countries are very important in global commodity markets, making up some of the largest producers of crucial minerals like nickel and copper and iron ore. And BRICS countries produce huge amounts of food, especially cereals and meat, which are needed to feed the world population. So it's not just that they represent more than 2/5 of the global economy and roughly half the world population. They also are commodity powerhouses, agriculture powerhouses, and energy powerhouses. So BRICS cannot be ignored. The global South is coming together, trying to form some kind of organization for economic cooperation as the global South grows in economic influence. So what does BRICS partner status mean? It means that a country is now part of BRICS and is on the path to becoming a full member in the near future. This is similar to the process that is used by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and many members of BRICS are already members of the SCO. The SCO is more of a security-oriented organization, whereas BRICS is more focused on economic cooperation and especially de-dollarization, creating alternatives to the US-dominated global financial system, which is based on the US dollar. At the 2024 summit in Russia, BRICS officially endorsed a comprehensive plan to transform the international monetary and financial system. I published a video and an article summarizing that report, explaining BRICS's proposal. I will link to that in the description below. But the point is that BRICS is creating alternative financial mechanisms to de-dollarize, so countries that are part of BRICS can trade together using their local currency, so they don't need the dollar. And they're also trying to create new platforms for investments in other currencies to create reserve assets, so central banks in BRICS countries can hold other assets, not just US dollars and US Treasury securities. They're also trying to create an alternative to the SWIFT interbank messaging system, which the US has weaponized in order to impose sanctions on countries, cutting out banks in countries like Russia. So BRICS is going to create alternative mechanisms so countries can process payments between banks. And BRICS is also talking about creating platforms to settle trade imbalances in gold and commodities, including wheat and oil, by creating exchanges that are located in BRICS countries, not the West. So if you want to get more information about that, I have it linked to in the description below. But now I want to go through some of the statistics showing how BRICS is becoming more and more influential in the world. So now that BRICS has 9 full members and 9 partner countries, together it represents roughly half of the global population. There are a little over 8 billion people in the world, and BRICS now has 4 billion people among its members and partners. So if you look at a list of the 20 most populous countries on Earth, 9 of those 20 are now part of BRICS. Of course, India and China are founding members of BRICS. India is the most populous. China is the second most populous. Together, they have more than 2.8 billion people. Indonesia, which is now a BRICS partner, is the 4th most populous country after the United States. So when you combine India, China, and Indonesia, they together represent more than 3 billion people. And then add in Brazil, which is the 7th most populous country. Then Russia is the 9th most populous country. And Ethiopia is the 10th most populous country. So 6 of the 10 most populous countries are now part of BRICS. And then you also have other very big countries like Egypt, Iran, and Thailand, which are also in the top 20 and are now part of BRICS. What about the global economy? Well, the original 5 BRICS members together represent more than 30% of world GDP measured at purchasing power parity, which accounts for what you can actually buy with the currency. So not just looking at market exchange rates, which especially at a time right now when the US dollar is very overvalued, it makes the US economy look bigger than it actually is. And it makes other countries where their currencies have fallen against the dollar look smaller than they actually are. So when you measure at purchasing power parity, you can see that the BRICS 5, the original members, now have a larger share of the world economy than the G7, which is the group of 7 colonialist countries that colonized most of the world. That is North America, Europe, and Japan. If you look at the 9 countries that are now full members of BRICS together, their GDP represents more than 36% of the entire world. China is the world's biggest economy at 19% of global GDP. India is 8% of world GDP. And other very big economies in BRICS include Russia at over 3.5%, Brazil at over 2.4%. Then we can add in the new 9 BRICS partner countries. And although their economies are smaller, Indonesia is still a major economy in the world. Indonesia represents roughly 2.4% of global GDP. And when you add together the BRICS 9 members plus the BRICS 9 partner countries, together they represent just over 41% of global GDP. However, with all of that said, I should point out that GDP is not the best measurement. What is GDP? Gross domestic product. It's a measurement of the value of all of the goods and services produced in a country in 1 year. However, if you look at a country like the United States, its economy looks like it's very strong, very powerful. But when you break down the composition of GDP, you can see that in reality, manufacturing, the actual production of tangible products that people need for our lives, is just over 10% of US GDP. However, 21% of US GDP comes from the FIRE sector, that is finance, insurance, and real estate. So when banks and realtors and brokers charge more fees, GDP goes up. Or 13% of US GDP consists of professional and business services, including things like white-collar workers such as lawyers and managers. So when US attorneys charge more fees, US GDP goes up. Another example is healthcare. Healthcare represents 18% of US GDP. However, the US health system is notoriously bad. It has some of the worst public health results in the industrialized world, and yet the US spends roughly twice as much on healthcare as a percentage of GDP compared to the other advanced economies in the OECD. Moreover, 8% of US GDP consists of something called imputed rents to owner-occupied housing. What does that mean? It means this is how much an owner of a house in the US would hypothetically pay to rent the house that they own and live in. So in other words, 8% of US GDP is imaginary. It doesn't exist. This is an example of how GDP can be sometimes useful, but it can also obscure. And at the end of the day, it doesn't actually show how productive your economy is if it can actually manufacture things that make people's lives better. And when you break down the sectors that make up GDP, you can see that a huge part of US GDP is overhead. It's corporate bureaucracy. It's fees and red tape and insurance, and you cannot eat that part of GDP. So a more useful measurement can be food production. Let's look at the share of BRICS countries in global food production. I'm looking here at data from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and it shows the main primary crops produced in the world, which together represent over half of all global agricultural production. In order of size, these are sugarcane, maize or corn, rice, wheat, palm oil, and potatoes. So let's look one by one. When it comes to global production of sugar, which is unfortunately the number one crop produced on Earth, but of course sugar is in almost everything these days, Brazil, India, and China together represent nearly 2/3 of global sugar production. And then look at maize or corn. Together, China and Brazil represent nearly 1/3 of global corn production. The US is the biggest producer. And then look at rice. China and India together make up more than half of global rice production. Look at wheat. China, India, and Russia make up more than 40% of global wheat production. Look at palm oil. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand together make up more than 80% of global palm oil production, and Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand are now partner countries of BRICS. And then look at potatoes. China and India make up nearly 40% of global potato production. So now let's look at global meat production. Chicken, pork, and beef make up 88% of global meat production. Chicken is 34%, pork is 34%, and beef is 20%. So in terms of chicken production, the USA is the biggest producer, but the second and third biggest producers are China and Brazil. Together, China and Brazil make up roughly 20% of global chicken production. Let's look at pork. China is by far the world's largest producer of pig meat, representing more than 40% of global pork production. Then there is cattle meat, or beef. The US is the world's biggest beef producer, but Brazil and China are the second and third biggest producers of beef, and together they make up around 20% of world beef production. What about eggs, or as the UN Food and Agriculture Organization puts it, hen eggs, from chickens? Well, there's no competition. China is by far the world's biggest producer of hen eggs, representing 34% of the entire world's production. India makes up 8%, the USA is 8%, Indonesia is 6%, Brazil is 4%, and Russia makes up 3%. So BRICS countries make up more than half of the world's production of eggs. What about seafood? Well, when it comes to global fish production, once again, China is off the charts. The UNFAO divides seafood between capture production and aquaculture production. China alone makes up more than half of global aquaculture production. And then India and Indonesia are the second and third largest. So together they represent more than 70% of global aquaculture production. And then China is also the world's single largest source of capture production of seafood, representing roughly 15%, followed by Indonesia in second place. So together, China and Indonesia make up more than 20% of global capture production of seafood. And finally, let's look at global production of vegetable oils. I already talked about palm oil, how Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, which are now all BRICS partner countries, represent nearly 90% of global production of palm oil. There's also soy oil. China and Brazil are the first and third largest producers, respectively, making up around half of global soybean oil production. China is the third largest producer of canola oil, and Russia is the second biggest producer of sunflower oil. So what's the message that I'm really trying to hit home here? That yes, BRICS makes up now more than 41% of world GDP, but when you look at sector by sector, BRICS is even more important because it makes food for the entire world. It is the breadbasket of the world. And then we can also look at energy. And here we can see how BRICS once again punches above its weight as a very important organization in terms of energy production. If you look at a list of the top 10 oil producers on Earth, half of those countries are in BRICS. The third largest producer of oil, Russia. The fourth largest producer of oil is China. The seventh largest producer is Iran. The eighth biggest producer is the UAE. And the ninth biggest is Brazil. Those 5 countries are all full members of BRICS now. Then if you look at global production of natural gas, once again, you can see how powerful BRICS is. The second biggest producer of gas is Russia. The third biggest is Iran. The 8th biggest producer is China. The 10th biggest is the UAE. The 11th biggest is Indonesia. And the 15th biggest is Malaysia, which is now a BRICS partner state. Of course, climate change is a global problem, especially that countries in the global south have been facing. So let's look at green energy. And here there's just no comparison. China is off the charts when it comes to investment in and installation of renewable energy. China has installed more solar and wind power capacity than the rest of the world combined. And China alone represents more than 80% of global investment in clean energy manufacturing. So once again, there's just no comparison. China is by leaps and bounds the global leader in renewable energy, in green technology. And the US and Europe are putting heavy tariffs on China because their companies cannot compete with Chinese companies. Finally, let's look at BRICS' position when it comes to global production of critical minerals, which are needed for renewable technologies and manufacturing. If you look at the list of the world's top iron ore producers, you can see that most of them are in BRICS. The second biggest producer of iron ore on Earth is Brazil. The third biggest is China. The fourth biggest is India. The fifth biggest is Russia. The eighth biggest is South Africa. The ninth biggest is Kazakhstan, which is now a BRICS partner. And the 10th biggest is Iran, which is now a full member of BRICS. And then if you look at global production of copper, you can see that there are some heavy hitters in BRICS. China is the world's third biggest producer of copper. Russia is the world's seventh biggest. And Indonesia is the ninth biggest. And we can see the same pattern if you look at global production of nickel, which is a very important mineral for the green transition for renewable energy. Indonesia is off the charts. No country comes even close to Indonesia when it comes to global production of nickel. The third biggest producer is Russia. The seventh biggest producer is China. The eighth biggest producer is Brazil. And the ninth biggest producer is Cuba, which is now a BRICS partner country. Those are some of the most important statistics showing how BRICS is very important in the world. The West would like you to believe that this is an unimportant organization, and because there are so many political differences that it won't make a difference in the world. But first and foremost, BRICS is an economic organization, a forum of global South countries, developing economies that are coming together to try to create new alternatives. They are challenging the dominance of Western economies, and especially they are seeking alternatives to the US dollar. They are trying to de-dollarize, to trade with each other in their local currencies, seeking investments in other currencies, seeking assets that they can hold in the reserves of their central bank so they're not entirely dependent on holding US Treasury securities, US government debt, which also helps to fund the US government as it wages wars around the world, as it imposes sanctions on 1/3 of countries on Earth. As I mentioned earlier, in 2024, BRICS held a historic summit in Russia in which they endorsed a blueprint that calls for transforming the international monetary and financial system. I have a separate video and article that I published summarizing BRICS's plan. I have linked to that in the description below. If you like the reporting that we do here at Geopolitical Economy Report, please like and subscribe. Please share this. I am Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. This is one of the key issues that we follow very closely. So be sure to come back soon to learn more about BRICS and the increasingly multipolar world that we live in. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.